So just to give you a little context to lead into the discussion about rerouting the school-to-prison pipeline, for those of you who are not from Cook County, actually, how many people here are not from Cook County? Okay.
Oh, wow, good amount.
So let me give you a little context about why this issue is so important to those of us in Cook County, but certainly these statistics are true across our nation. But the Cook County Juvenile Temporary Detention Center, 65 to 70% of detainees have at least one diagnosable mental health disorder. 70% have experienced a traumatic event. 48% function below their academic grade level. 30% have a diagnosed learning disability, and 30% have a history of abuse prior to incarceration. Behind each of these startling statistics is a kid. And the stories that involve lack of access to mental health care, being pushed out of the school system because of learning disabilities, chronic untreated trauma, poverty, and homelessness. These are kids who don't deserve just a second chance, but I actually think they deserve a first chance. I get to go to work every day as the executive director of the James B. Moran Center for Youth Advocacy. We are a legal aid agency that serves the city of Evanston, just north of the city of Chicago. And we provide integrated legal and social work services to low-income youth and their families. And we advocate for children's rights in the court system, in the education system, and most recently in the mental health care system. Navigating complex mazes of each of these systems is a daunting task. And for children and families who lack resources, any missteps, any, along the way can funnel a child from their families and communities into prisons. And I don't want to just talk about prisons. It's bigger than that. It's broken institutions. And the Moran Center believes that we need to stop punishing kids who have had punishing lives. And our unique model provides legal representation paired with wraparound social work services to support children in our community and out of these institutions. That's a little bit about the context, why this issue is so important to me and why this issue is so important here in Cook County. I'm joined today by two phenomenal people, and I'm going to give you a brief bio, and trust me, they could do a much better job telling their own stories than I will be able to, but just for the sake of time, I'm going to try my best at telling their stories quickly. The first is Xavier McElrath Bay. Xavier's first exposure to the court system occurred at the age of 11 when he was accidentally shot in the face by his best friend. While hospitalized, he was questioned repeatedly by the police, but when he refused to turn in his friend, he suddenly became labeled as a criminal instead of a victim. In middle school, Xavier was made a ward of the state and repeatedly detained to solve his chronic truancy problem. At 13, after accumulating 19 arrests and 7 convictions, Xavier was charged and then later convicted of a gun-related first-degree murder. During the 13 years of his incarceration, Xavier became increasingly remorseful and took advantage of many educational opportunities that were then available in IDOC. And Xavier actually wanted me to emphasize then available. Not so today. Since his release in 2002, Xavier has been a spokesman for youth justice, and today is senior advisor and national advocate with the campaign for the fair sentencing of youth. And I also have Angelica with me. Angelica was raped at the age of 15. And devastatingly, no one believed her. Angelica unraveled, self-medicating and skipping classes. Acting on a dare, Angelica committed a strong-arm robbery, resulting in her arrest in her school cafeteria. In 2009, Angelica was sentenced to the Illinois Youth Center in Warrenville for violating her probation. For the next 4 years, Angelica bounced in and out of Illinois' youth prisons for probation and parole violations. While incarcerated, Angelica participated in Storycatchers Theater's Fabulous Females program, an outlet for young women to experience success through the process of writing and performing original dramatic and musical material inspired by their own personal experiences. Since 2011, Angelica has acted as a spokesperson and performer for Storycatchers. Angelica also serves as a manager for her family business in Chicago. So I think we are really lucky to be able to hear from both Angelica and Xavier today, and together we're going to explore all the educational barriers and the barriers to educational justice in an effort to unpack this very complex school-to-prison pipeline. So the first question I'm going to throw to Xavier. Oh, no, I'm going to throw it to you, actually. So Angelica, I think in hearing your story from you, and then I also urge you all to check out, you Google Angelica. She did an unbelievable performance at the Aspen Ideas Festival a few years ago, and that's where I also got to know a little bit more about Angelica. I really encourage you to look at that performance. But Angelica, in understanding your story, many, many adults failed to support you after you were sexually victimized. And understandably, you then harmed yourself and then you harmed others. You acted out. How did the system, so when I say system, I mean schools, courts, community, respond to your acting out? And then ideally, how should those systems have supported you?
Well, when I first was charged with my first offense, which was the robbery, instead of dealing with the issue at hand to find out what went wrong and why did I commit this crime and why a student who had fared to good attendance and made good grades her freshman year suddenly started skipping school almost every day sophomore year, and what other issues were going on. I never seen a guidance counselor until I was already receiving 2-week suspensions. So my school tried to expel me and referred me to a program. The program was basically detention. And even though there was different organizations from when I was initially attacked that contacted my family, letting her know, you need to put your daughter in counseling for this. My family didn't do that. So I just took to my own devices and used my own skills that I had at the time that I obtained from growing up in my neighborhood to get through my trauma on my own. When I ended up incarcerated, my probation officer decided which at the time I was already a college student, my probation officer decided that it would be better instead of me returning to college in the fall, she placed me in a residential rehab. And when that didn't work out, I was sentenced to Illinois Department of Corrections and not to exceed my 21st birthday. And at the time, I was 17. So one thing I want to note about the juvenile justice system is that when I was on juvenile parole, a phone call from my mom to my parole officer, or a dirty drop, or even my mom saying you can't stay here anymore, were all violations that sent me back to prison. And upon going back to prison and being revoked in my board hearing, I would, because of the dirty drops and the self-medicating, each time I would go back, I would have to do a 6-month program in order to be re-released. So every time I violated, I was going away for anywhere from 8 months to a year and a half.
Xavier, I don't know if there's anything you would want to respond to that question as well. In specific to adults failing you and the systems failing you.
Yeah, for me personally, I mean, just hearing your story, and it brings back a lot of memories as it relates to the institutions and people I engage with. Whether that was a teacher, whether that was a probation officer, I remember a lot of that was very antagonistic. There wasn't much given to unconditional positive regard. There wasn't much given to compassion. And in response to that, I would simply say that it is very important that the adults who engage with these children come through a lens of compassion and care. as simple as that is, it is deeply impactful and it makes a tremendous difference. And I will share more about the people who made a difference in my life, but I would simply say that just as committed as that gang member is, just as committed as that pimp, just as committed as that drug dealer is, to wake that kid up every morning to see where they're at, to invest in that person's life, to satisfy some of the most basic and fundamental human needs, we as a society, as institutions, as adults who are responsible, need to be 10 times more committed to invest in that child's life, to provide a more positive means for love and support. And I would simply say that.
Yeah. That's been a running theme throughout this whole conference, right? That word compassion. And we as adults, it's on us. Xavier, what signs did you exhibit in elementary school, middle school, that adults might have missed, or maybe they mistreated or misdiagnosed? And then by missing or misunderstanding your behavior, how did the system then lead to your incarceration as a child, potentially?
My responses to trauma, I think, were manifested in a way that the traditional, academics and even, understanding of youth development were not understood at that time. Understand when I'm 42 years old today. When I was in elementary school, we're talking about the early to mid 80s. I'll give one story to explain how trauma was manifested and how it was largely ignored for me. And the approach could have been taken in two different ways. One was very dominant, very negative as far as my outcomes was concerned. I was 12 years old. I was kicked out of Hamline Elementary in back of the yards. I lived in the south side of Chicago. When I was kicked out of the school, I was sent to Graham Elementary, which is about a mile away from where I lived. I would take the Racine Wallace bus straight there. I started having problems with the gangs in my neighborhood because I was gang involved. At the time, I was in 6th or 7th grade. I remember my probation officer setting it up so I can get bussed in with other kids. A yellow bus would stop by my house, and that was his intervention to sort of deal with the violence that I was contending with. But it wasn't enough. They were waiting for me after school. The rival gang members were waiting for me. I tried to explain that to my probation officer, and he said that, what are you talking about rival gangs? You shouldn't be in a gang. So the mere problem itself, the mere existence of that problem, entailed me doing something wrong. And so I was very isolated in that experience from that point forward, and I kept my mouth shut. But I was detained because I had missed some days in school. And when I came out, he said, Xavier, if you don't keep going to school, this is going to happen to you over and over again. And for me, in my mind, in my short vision, I thought the best thing I can do is go to school, obviously. But because I was in fear of my life, having been a previous gunshot victim, in fact, that earlier that year in the summer, I decided to bring a gun to school to protect myself. And I remember being on a bus, and one of the kids that was close to me, I said, look, I have a gun. If you have any problems, let me know. He was a younger kid from my side of the tracks, and he was also very fearful. When I went into class, hours had passed, and I remember sitting to the back of the room, and an officer came into the room and stood by the door and motioned for the teacher, and the teacher walked over. And the teacher whispered some words to him, and then he said out loud, Xavier? And I looked at him, and I looked around like, I hope he's not talking about me. I'm the only Xavier, obviously. My heart was pounding. I was afraid. I didn't know what was going on. I thought my probation officer was there to violate my probation all over again. It goes to show how much I wasn't thinking about the consequence. I remember going into the principal's office, and when I got inside a small room, there was a circle table. I'll never forget, and I sat down. There was another officer standing there. Another one had sat in front of me. The school counselor was there, and the principal was a little bit off at a distance. And I remember there was a big giant manila envelope in the middle of the table. I just kept looking at it, and I didn't really catch my eye for any particular reason, but I didn't understand why it was there. And the officer said, Xavier, I'm going to ask you one question. And I said, what's that? Now, understand, the gun that I had brought to the school was a very small .22 caliber gun. It was an automatic, broken down. It probably didn't even work, never tested it. It just made me feel safe. And I remember when he picked up the manila envelope, he reached inside, and he pulled out this big old giant gun. And this thing was a big silver, the biggest gun I've ever seen in my entire life. And he said, I have one question for you, Xavier. Is this your gun? And I was like, hell no, that ain't my gun. My gun's over there. My gun's smaller than that one.
Yeah.
I was like, because in my child mind, the bigger, the worse trouble I'm in, you know? Like, I'm thinking my small gun is less trouble. I'd rather take responsibility for that gun than take the one for that big old giant gun. As a child, that's how I thought and how I processed things. But I didn't realize that a gun is a gun. And if you bring a gun to school, you committed a crime. And when I remember being arrested, being placed in cuffs after I took him to my book bag and they pulled the weapon out, for me, it wasn't something that I was not used to. I was used to getting arrested. But it was the first time I had ever been incarcerated from within the school setting. And because of that, it felt kind of awkward and even embarrassing, to be honest with you. You know, I felt shamed, a little bit of shame. And this is before Columbine. This is before all the mass shootings that we know of today. But another small little part of me thought, you know, maybe the people in the school, the kids in the school would think that I'm big and bad and tough now. But I remember also being arrested, having this sort of small sense of injustice because I was afraid of going to school in the first place. I never had anyone to talk to. But looking back upon that time, I could tell you that school counselor never sat me down to talk with me. When I brought that gun to the school, no one ever asked, Xavier, why are you bringing guns into school? When I was a gunshot victim and coming into the school with fresh wounds and still contending with lockjaw, why didn't they say, why is this kid a victim of violence? No one really attended to the needs that I had. And so for me, trauma manifested itself in a very negative way, and which is why I had, by the time of 13, 19 arrests and 7 convictions. Trauma was also exhibited in those very same arrests. Trauma was exhibited in the fact that 4 or 5 times I was arrested for trespassing, criminal trespassing of property. Oftentimes I was sleeping in abandoned buildings to stay away from a home that was filled with violence and substance and alcohol abuse. So for me as a child, to answer the question of how it was being exhibited, unfortunately and sadly it was being exhibited to those very same arrests. Right. But without compassion and accident restorative approaches to that, sadly I was obviously, you know, fed fast-paced into the justice system.
What I say often when I represent children in court, I often have to remind prosecutors and judges that my clients' actions are logical, and that children act logically. They are not illogical beings. They respond to what is thrust on them. So if anyone had asked you, why did you bring a gun to school, you would have had a logical answer to that question. And all my clients have logical answers to that question if posed. So that's another thing I think we have to think about is the logic of children. And anyway. Angelica, I want to ask you a question. So my understanding is that you attended a lot of schools in the city of Chicago. And so you kind of have a really good vantage point, unlike maybe some of us in the room, as to what makes a good school and what makes a bad school, and how can we make more good schools and less bad schools. So what do you think?
Well, growing up, I went from a Lutheran school to, well, first I attended a public school, then a Lutheran school, then a Catholic school, then back to public school, then to 2 different charter schools, and that was all before high school. So, in my own personal experience, going to public school in kindergarten, I had to go through a metal detector every day in kindergarten because another kid in my grade in kindergarten brought a knife to school in their backpack. So going from public school to private school was a vast difference. One year I was in Catholic school, I was in a class of 12 when the teacher was able to give us one-on-one attention all the time. None of the kids in this 12-kid classroom needed any tutoring, and we all had good grades, and anything we didn't understand, our teacher would come back and take the time to explain it to us, and even if it was something we needed a little extra help with. The next year, I went back to public school, and I went to public school in my neighborhood, and I went from a class of 12 to a class of 36.
Oh.
And not only was my classroom very overcrowded, but most of my classroom didn't speak any English. So the teacher had to contend with trying to cater to the needs of the kids who were new to this country and still trying to keep the attention of the kids that were raised speaking English. So a lot of times the kids, that knew English, we kind of had to work by ourselves, or our teacher would have us help the kids that didn't know English because she was spending the majority of her time with them. So it kind of enabled a few of us to kind of slip through the cracks and not really have too much leeway in the classroom and not really be instructed or taught. Going into charter school classrooms were much smaller than the average public school, but there was a great emphasis on just doing good for the standardized tests. That way they can get their funding. But when it came down to the real issues of the everyday that were happening every day in our classrooms, those were ignored. 1 year in a charter school, we went through 4 math teachers. And these math teachers would quit in the middle of the year. Not only in the middle of the year, in the middle of a quarter, right before our progress reports would come out. So that shift would always kind of throw not just me, but a lot of other students off. Looking back now, I see, they talk a good game, a lot of these charter schools, especially ones that I've had experience with. They advocate that, we're open enrollment for kids from all different neighborhoods. I'm also from the South Side as well. And, it sounds good to a lot of parents that are in impoverished communities or underserved communities. But in reality, they're just grouping a lot of kids together, and they're not really addressing personal needs because they're still looking at their needs, which is they need to keep up with the Joneses and they need to keep up with the funding and the good image of what a charter school is.
So one thing in getting to know the both of you, and then I also think this is true for all of us, is all of us in this room on earth are only successful if we are in relationship with each other, especially with those who educate us and mentor us. It's about relationship. You spoke to me, Xavier, about how a relationship you developed in IDOC really changed your trajectory and your educational trajectory, and that it was a relationship and not a computer that really was the reason why you turned a corner. So can you speak about that?
It's funny, we talk about the school to prison pipeline. It's funny how for me it was inverse. Right. It was inverse of that. Right. That I never really never really gave myself a chance to learn. Never really had the privilege, honestly, to be able to make that a priority in my life growing up. But in prison, obviously, at the very early part of my sentence, I went from, at the age of 13 and 14 and 15 in the temporary juvenile detention center here in Cook County, to IYC Joliet. And IYC Joliet at the time was a very volatile environment. There was riots repeatedly, and sadly even also inside the school. What was the golden path for most youth, which was again to GD program, was something that I had only thought about as it related to my ability to get out of the cell and to be able to have programming, which was what allowed us to have more movement around the campus, or around the institution that I was in. And it's very interesting because while I was there, in class the first day, I remember we did our assessment test. The next day that I arrived, I was embarrassed because I had a sixth grade average. I was even questioning, how did I even get in this class in the first place? But obviously someone thought I needed to be there. And I remember Gene, our instructor, he said, this can be 2 outcomes here. If you're really committed to learning, I guarantee you're going to pass with flying colors. I don't care where you are, whether you have any weaknesses or strengths in this class. We're going to work together as a community, as a class, and we're going to work through these challenges together. We are going to pass. And I remember my weakest subject was math. I was afraid of all these words of geometry, algebra, and all this things. no way I could ever, be able to grasp these things. And I remember even struggling with division at the time, strange enough. But he worked with on a very individual basis, but also created this sort of common purpose and meaning. And I remember within 8 weeks of just really listening to him, following the sort of new primary group that has been sort of created within this space, that however negative it was, when we were in that classroom, none of that mattered. Our gang ties didn't matter. What we had been through, our sentence, our time, none of that mattered. What mattered is that we had a common mission here. And I went from a 6th grade point average to a 12.9 average within 8 weeks. And I remember taking the test and passing, and it was really just blown away, and it reinforced within me this belief that, you know what, Xavier, you can do it. And I can honestly say that he played a big role in my confidence, my sense of self-worth. He gave me a sense that I could do something more meaningful in my future. But sadly, at that time, I still had around 9 more years to go in prison. But he, at the very least, planted the seed that allowed me many years later to walk out of prison with 2 associate degrees, a bachelor's degree in social science, and a 4.0 GPA, having been inducted to the Franklin Honor Society for Outstanding Scholarship. And because of that, I can say he made a big difference in my life. Yeah.
And I would just say on an editorial note that relationships matter, but relationships are expensive.
Yeah.
Gene is a lot more expensive than 10 computers, but Gene is far more worth the investment, I think. But Angelica, and then I want you to tell this audience about story catchers and how that was a real turning point for you, because everyone has seen the impact of the performances today of story catchers, but they haven't got to hear from an actual graduate of story catchers. So could you share that?
Well, I remember the first time that I was in IYC Warrenville. I wanted to take my mind off the drug program I was going to have to do. And I wanted to take my mind off the time that I was facing, which was ultimately a year and a half back then. So I joined a program called Fabulous Females, which is within Story Catchers. And it's a program in IYC Warrenville just for girls. And it's broken down into 3 sessions a year. The first session is a writing workshop. The second session is a spring preview. And then the third session is a full-scale production, which is a full-length musical that we perform in the fall for not only our families and the other girls in the institution, but for the community as well. So when I first got involved in the program, I was really excited because I had always been in the arts. I'd always been a dancer. I'd been in different performance plays as a child. So the arts is something that, the performing arts is always something that really engaged me and held my attention. But I never did creative writing before. And in the creative writing session, that's when I really had a breakthrough within myself that really began my healing process. I held a lot of resentment, a lot of anger, and I was just mad at life over some of the cards that I thought I was dealt that was unfair, some of the things and traumas that happened to me. So when I was able to go to the creative writing session and hear some of the other girls' stories, which, by the way, mostly all of the girls that I was incarcerated with had faced similar, if not worse, traumas than I did. So when I was able to hear their stories and see that I wasn't the only one, I was able to become compassionate. And when I became compassionate, I was able to heal. And when I was able to heal, I was able to apply that on stage and really change my life around from the inside out. And then upon my release, I went to work full-time for Story Catchers as well.
That's awesome. Thank you. Arts matter too. So we have 5 minutes. Actually, according to my clock, I have 6. But I have 5. I'll take it. I don't see any questions in my app thingy. So I'm going to take a risk and I'm going to open it up to questions. But before you raise your hand, I want to make sure it is a question, and secondly, that it's a good one, because we're not going to have much time for lots of them. Yes, I like your confidence. It's a lot of pressure, but I put it on you. You can do it.
But I'll try it. The first thing I wanted to do.
And I'll repeat the question too. Oh, thank you, sir. Perfect.
Thank you so much. The first thing I wanted to do is just say I'm in awe of both of you. And you are shining survivors. And I hope that you at times take time to reflect on where you've been. And it's just a magnificent story. So thank you for sharing it with us. So thinking about the root, a lot of the work that we tend to do focuses on the unmet emotional needs within a school setting. So if you have an IEP, whatnot, combined with a zero tolerance policy that so many schools have, where they say, let's call the cops and let's figure that out. My question is, in your situations, did this approach of kind of punishment and consequences, was that the basis for why you were singled out, arrested, expelled? And if there had been a kind of a different, all behavior has meaning, trauma-informed care, would that have had a different path for you?
That's a great question. Who wants to start?
Okay, well, I definitely feel that it was a consequential system. And speaking on the trauma that had occurred to me beforehand, I didn't receive any help, any counseling. So it was not until I was already incarcerated that I felt that I was getting the help I deserved. Not from the institution itself, but actually from the program that I was in. So had I had known before I had ever been incarcerated that there was programs out there that I could be in, I think it would have been a very good preventative measure in keeping me not only off the streets, but from committing other crimes. And I think ultimately I would have been able to avoid prison altogether.
Yeah, I mean, I look at some of today's models, and so just to speak more about the work that I do, I work for the national, it's called the Campaign for the Fair Sentencing of Youth. And our goal as an organization is to scale back extreme sentencing for kids, in particular any life without parole across the country. Right now, there are over 20 states that have banned this practice, an additional 4 that use it on the most rarest of occasions. And a lot of this reform has been made possible through the U.S. Supreme Court decisions and directly impacted folks partnering with our policy team along with others across the country that really look at the issues that impact the lives of kids, in particular, and particularly speaking about Black and brown youth who receive this sentence disproportionately. I can tell you the majority of the kids that I've worked with throughout the years, as an outreach worker, as a gay intervention specialist, as well as a clinical research interviewer with Northwestern University, and also working as a juvenile justice diversion program coordinator with Alternatives, a small community-based organization, I can tell you the majority of the kids that I've worked with oftentimes fought themselves at this sort of cross-fix situation where they were dealing with institutions and adults that had different expectations and that they were often very consequential to each other. And so what happened, for example, for me, as a great example, is that I would often have to meet the expectations of my probation officer of being in the school, of simply being there. I remember him coming to my house in the midday and during the school day, and I ran out my back door because he told me to put on my coat because I was going to have to go back to juvenile detention. But what was important to the school was that it was not that I was just there, but there was no conflict. The challenge there for me personally is that I was constantly in conflict. I was literally in fear of my life. And so if I didn't fight the rival gang members, then I would become even more victimized. If I was not aggressive in that environment, sadly, that would only exacerbate the trauma, the repeated trauma of being chased, of being sought out by rival gang members. And so these sort of conflicting expectations and no one to talk to, for me personally, always just resulted in the most extreme and unfortunate outcome. There's no mistake that a 13-year-old child, after 19 arrests and 7 convictions, standing in front of a judge and being treated as an adult, there's no mistake that that child ended up there. The reality is that I was a kid who experienced severe abuse and neglect within my home, contended with poverty, was repeatedly, along with my family, evicted from home to home, living in the most dire situations, living in places where roaches and rats were the most permanent indwellers, places we were often, evicted from. The sad reality is that my stepfather was very abusive, and he would also often beat my mother, hit us, and kick our dog. The sad reality is that by the time I was 11 years old, I was a gunshot victim, having been through the foster care system and having had between ages 6 and 8.5 years old to contend with a very mean and very violent foster mother. There's no mistake that I ended up in front of that judge. And I will never forget when I received my sentence, the state's attorney said, Your Honor, the defendant has an extensive juvenile arrest record indicative of a violent nature. And under no circumstance should be considered for early release. When I went into the system, I had no hope of a future. I was given a 25-year sentence for something that I had done at the age of 13 years old. I was a kid that was defined as a monster, as incorrigible. And with that stamp upon me, I went into a system with very little hope. And so for me, when I look back upon my childhood, I realized that the school to prison pipeline isn't just about the very institution and the folks that are engaged there. It's about recognizing that all our kids in the justice system who are going to be funneled into the system are, in our city, CPS students. It's appropriate that when we hear the unfortunate outcome of a child who's been killed in the streets, that we say that a CPS student was killed. You don't hear about a CPS student that gets incarcerated or that's given a 25-year sentence. You don't hear about a CPS student. You don't recognize the victimization of that very same child who oftentimes, in my position, in my community, often alternated between those roles of victims and offenders. The sad reality is that we're talking about the same kids. That very same kid at the age of 12, when I brought a gun to the school, was the very same kid who was repeatedly chased and victimized over and over again, inside and outside the home. And sadly, the reality is that oftentimes, and sadly, even with the media, whenever someone's shot, they bring back the old negative about that individual, to take away the humanity of that person, to desensitize us all to the real needs that exist in these communities. So when I think about what makes the systems better, it has to go beyond the class. It has to address the needs that exist in our community, the poverty, the lack of opportunity and resources, the lack of meaningful relationships with law enforcement. I cannot tell you the amount of times I was literally beaten by the police, and that in fact, when I got my 25 years, it was based upon one very strong piece of evidence. And that was the confession that I was literally beaten into at the age of 13 years old. So understand, there's a lot for me personally, but I can tell you I'm not the exception to the rule in regards to the outcomes and potential for success and positive change, but I'm also not the exception to the rule when it comes to the reality that these kids are still contending with that at this very moment, and we have to do something about it. Thank you.
So that's it. I think it's a good note to end on. I thank Xavier and Angelica for leading us today, and thank you all for coming.